Hi, I'm Josh. I'm the Youth Program Director here at Urban Workshop, and today we're going to be making the wooden part of the Bluetooth speaker box. So as usual, we like to start our projects with a reminder about safety. So going to be using a variety of different woodshop tools. A couple important things right here at the beginning. One, always make sure you have a nice pair of safety glasses. And two, I've got a pair of earbuds here that I'm going to use for my hearing protection. So those are standard in any wood shop, anywhere that you go. And then there'll be machine-specific stuff as we go. So the first thing we're going to do is I have a single piece of lumber from the wood yard, and I'm going to check to make sure that it's the actual dimensions that we need before I make any mistakes down the line. So I know from my earlier calculations that I need a single 5-foot piece. And I can see here that I've got a 5-foot piece, and I know that it needs to be at least 5.5 inches wide. And I can see here with some of my wood, I've got this right here that I'm going to need to cut off. But even including that bit that I'm going to cut off, I have more than 5.5 inches. So I know I've got the piece of wood that I actually need. When you go to the lumber yard, you're going to want to check for any knots or any imperfections in your wood that may mess up your ability to complete your project. Now, also when you bring this back, you cannot assume that either the top and bottom surfaces are flat or this edge right here is flat. So it's really important that when you get that piece of wood that you run it along something like a jointer, which is where we're going to start today, to make sure that we've got at least one flat edge to start. So the first step in this project is going to be running this through the jointer right here, and then I know I've got a flat edge to butt up against the table saw when we go to use that tool later. So this edge already looks somewhat flat, and this edge looks like there's been nothing done to it. We call this the unmilled edge, and this the milled edge. I'm going to put the milled edge through the jointer so that we don't have to remove quite as much material. It's a little bit quicker and a little bit better to start with that edge. So to do that, I'm going to turn the machine on, and I'm going to make sure it's flat against this fence and flat against the surface of the table. Now that we've run this through the jointer, we're going to move on to the planer to get it down to the final thickness that we would like to work with. Okay, now that we have one edge jointed and completely flat, the next step is we're going to come over here to the planer and we're going to plane this wood down to our final thickness. So we'd like this to be 3/4 of an inch thick, and I have a caliper right here. We are currently 0.835 inches thick. So we need to remove just about an inch of material, a little bit less than an inch of material from this piece right here. Now on the planer, it's very important that we connect the dust collection system and turn it on before we start, because this makes a big mess. But before we do that, I'm going to describe how you actually set this up so that you don't remove too much material on your first pass, and so that you don't remove too much material on any pass. I'm going to place my wood flat against the surface of our planer table here. I'm going to feed it in just slightly, and then I'm going to bring the planer, the front of our planer right here, down until it touches the wood, just like that, where it's touching. And then once it touches, I'm going to dial it back 1, 2 full turns, and we're going to do a test pass just to make sure that we don't remove too much material. Now before I start, I'm going to go ahead and make sure the dust collection is turned on. Turn the machine on. Keeping it flat against the surface, I'm going to feed it through. And on the back side, I'm going to keep it flat against that surface as well by putting a little gentle pressure down as the wood is fed out. And at this stage, I'm going to bring it down about 1/4 of a turn and feed it through again, since on the first pass I didn't get any material. And I'm going to continue to do this. I didn't really remove much material on that pass either, so we'll go another 1/4 turn down. And I'm going to continue to do this until my final material thickness is 3/4 of an inch. I'll periodically check. We're at 0.79, about 0.8 right now. We're at 0.77, maybe one more small pass, or two, and we should be pretty close to our final dimension. And we're almost exactly 0.75 right now. So I'm going to turn my machine off, make sure that I clean up my workspace, and we'll move on to the table saw. All right, for this segment, we are going to first cut off the unmilled side that we did not joint in the first step. And we're going to do that slightly wider than our final dimension, and you'll see why we do that a little bit later on. So first things first, when we come up to the table saw, we're going to want to make sure that the actual blade is set up correctly, that especially with the table saw, it's very important that you operate this safely. You can see right now the blade's out of the table saw. When you come up to it, it's generally a good idea to start with the blade all the way down just like this. So to set up for our piece, I am going to bring that blade up just a little bit. I want my final dimension to be 5.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove some of this material to make my wood 5.75, so I have a little extra to cut off later when I actually need it. So to do that, I'll unlock the fence. I will set it to 5.75. First, I'm going to check to make sure it's square. Okay, set it to 5.75. I'm going to lock the fence back down. It's very important that you lock the fence. You don't want to move your wood through the table saw if this fence isn't secured, because if it moves as you're pushing the wood through, your wood could get jammed or stuck in the blade. It could pull your fingers towards it, so you want to be very careful and double check that you've locked this fence down. Now, once I've locked the fence down, I like to dial it up and use a tape measure to double check both the front and the back of the blade to make sure that we're at 5 3/4. That looks pretty good to me. Now I also like to make sure that the area that I'm going to push my wood into is clear and that I know that it's not going to fall off the table, making it likely that my hand could be in a general vicinity of the blade. And last but not least, I'm going to use a push block. I really like these gripper push blocks. They have some rubber on the bottom and some grip bits here. So I'm going to use this to finish pushing my piece entirely through. So we're set to 5 3/4. The next step, bring your piece of wood up. We're going to set the table saw blade height. Now I like to go just about between 1/8 and 1/16 of an inch above the actual workpiece so that the carbide tip blade on the saw sits a little bit above. Once I've got that blade height set, I'm ready to go. I'm going to put my hearing protection in. And you want to make sure you cut off the side that wasn't milled, the side that wasn't jointed in our first step, so that we have 2 flat surfaces to work from later on. So once we're set up here, I'll turn my dust collection on. I'll turn my table saw blade on. Switch to using my push block when my fingers start getting close to that blade. I'm going to push it completely outside of the blade. Turn it off. And turn my dust collection on. Let it come to a complete stop. Never reach your fingers down near that blade as it's still spinning. And then I can remove my pieces of wood. So now, it's always a good idea also to continue to check throughout your workpiece that you actually got the dimensions that you think you got. So I can see here it's exactly 5 3/4 on that end. If I check the other end, hopefully we're within the ballpark of 5 3/4. And also on the other side, I'm exactly 5 3/4. So I got what I want here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to angle the blade because we're going to be making mitered edges that fit together that we glue up in one of the later steps. So to do that, I'm going to get my saw blade set up and we'll start there. For this step, we're going to make this a little bit easier to manage. So instead of having to work this whole piece through the table saw, we are actually going to cut it in half already with the beveled edge. So the way we're going to do that, I'm going to measure 2.5 feet. So my framing square and draw a straight line across. Turn my dust collection on. And now we've got our mitered edge, and we're ready to work back on the table saw. All right, here we are, back at the table saw. Now we're going to make cross cuts on the long walls of our Bluetooth speaker box. Those need to be 11.5 inches. So I'm going to take my tape measure, and with the miter edge facing up like this, I'm going to measure from that top mitered edge 11.5 inches and make a mark. Then I'm going to take my framing square, draw a line across like this. So I have a line to mark. And set a fence also going to draw a line down the edge the way I'd like to have it cut. That's going to help me line up my saw blade here so I get the cut I want. Should look something like that. When I've got my piece lined up, I want to make repeat cuts. So I'm going to make a stop block here. I don't actually need my fence. I'm going to move my fence out of the way even more. I'm going to make a stop block here. Secure it down. Now it's really important, specifically on a table saw, if you're going to be making a crosscut, that you have the correct blade for a crosscut and that you have some sort of backing or additional fence behind you. Crosscuts are more dangerous on a table saw, so this setup is going to improve safety and make it less likely that we hurt ourselves making a crosscut. That's because additional tension builds up between the blade and the wood as it cuts across the grain fibers. Typically, with table saws, you're making rip cuts or along the grain, but in this case, I need to be aware of what orientation my wood grain is, know that I'm cutting across that grain, and take the necessary safety precautions to not hurt myself when I'm doing that. All right, I've turned my dust collection on. I've got my ear protection in. I know I have my blade height set correctly. The blade is a little bit higher than the wood itself. Now, while I'm holding this down, and while my wood is not touching the blade, I'm going to turn it on. I let my blade come to a complete stop, and you can see I have a nice clean mitered edge on the other side. Now, I'm going to flip my piece of wood over the other way, because when I make my miters, I'd like them to glue up at a 90-degree angle. To do that, I need the cuts to be in this orientation. So I'm going to flip my wood over. Once again, I'm going to make sure I'm holding it down. It's not touching the blade itself. I'm going to go ahead and make 3 more cuts. Now I'm going to take a minute to readjust my fence. Let's double check. Probably I should have double checked this earlier, but let's see if we're in the realm. We're almost exactly 11.5 inches on those cuts. So those look like they turned out pretty well. Now next up, I want my box to be 11.5 by 5.5 on the outside. So what I'm going to do is exactly the same thing I did in the first step here. Except for the 2 short pieces left over, I'm going to make the 2 end caps of the speaker. So I'm going to measure 5.5 inches on both of these, make a mark at 5.5, and then once again I'm going to use my framing square to draw that line straight across. And then with the angle that I'm going to want, I'm going to go ahead and do that on the edge again. Now it's worth taking your time and getting this part right, because when you have these mitered edges, it's pretty difficult to get them to fit really well. So the better you measure, the more time you take now, the less time you'll spend in the end trying to get everything right. Okay, I'm going to readjust my fence. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a cut. Now, we have less room on this piece of wood, so it's really important that as I'm holding this down, I know exactly where that blade is at all times. You don't want to get to the stage where you get your finger a little bit too close to that blade and you end up getting hurt. So this is what we're going to do here. As sawdust builds up in these edges, it can sometimes make your piece of wood sit off a little bit. So it's generally a good idea to kind of brush some of that dust off along the way. In the last step, we cut mitered edges on 2 of the 4 pieces here, and I can actually use that mitered edge to line up the final 2 miters for the rest of our pieces. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to wedge this between the fence and the blade, and I'm going to bring it up until it's just touching. Now it's important here that you readjust your table saw blade height. You don't want this to be too high. I'm going to set it about between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch above our piece. Okay. Okay. Lock the fence down. Okay, we're secure here. Have all of your pieces ready. And for this step, since we're making a rip cut, you notice I've removed the miter sled. The rip cut builds up a little bit less tension, but because we're using a hardwood, you still need to be careful. So in this step, I'm going to use the push block. And the push block has little bits on the bottom here that make it nice to hook on the edge. I want to make sure this flat surface is lined up against the surface of my fence. Push it all the way to the edge here. Get everything lined up. Turn my dust collection on. And I'm going to run through all of these pieces now. And now we've cut the two short sides. We're going to do exactly the same thing for all four of our long pieces. So we're going to miter both edges. Now at this point, let the blade stop. It's generally a good idea to remove that material as it gets stuck in there. It's not stuck between a spinning blade and a fence, so it's likely not going to shoot out very hard, but it is generally a good idea to clean it out, and definitely don't clean it out while the blade is running. Now at this point, it's a good idea to visually inspect your wood to make sure that all your mitered edges look about like they should look. Okay. And it looks like we made some pretty nice cuts. On to the next step.